So welcome.
Thank you for having us.
We're so excited to be here. Yeah.
So just brief introductions. Tell me who you are and your film, and then we'll talk about it.
I'm Meg Griffiths. I am the co-director and producer of Impossible Town.
I'm Scott Faris. I am the co-director and cinematographer and co-editor of Impossible Town.
Okay. I have so many questions. I'm fascinated by the story. I'm fascinated by your collaboration and how you came to this film. But let's talk about the narrative itself. This region in West Virginia. What is happening? You have your protagonist and her late father, and then the dramatic tension of what they're going to do about this. Tell me. We'll get to where the title comes from, but this what is happening in this part of the world that I think part of a common theme in documentaries like this, or even fiction, is there are pockets of this everywhere. We're just not seeing it. The people who are living it. So tell me about this region in West Virginia.
Well, our film takes place in the southern part of the state, in a small annexed community known as Minden, which at one point in the 50s and 60s was a bustling coal community. Some claim that the population was over 1,500. Am I getting that number right?
I think it was over 2,000.
Over 2,000 even. Today it is roughly 250 people,
Wow.
So has vastly diminished from its peak. And that has largely resulted just as a byproduct of changing industry in the state of West Virginia. Coal is, as we all know, on its way out.
Right.
And with it, that way of life and these little bustling coal-centered communities like Minden.
But I think one of the leftovers from the coal industry are these chemicals. In Minden, it happens to be PCBs, and these are chemicals that were used during the boom of the coal industry, and now have been left behind in communities, have been dealing with the legacy of those contaminations.
And there's that haunting scene of one of the locals, basically his version of pointing out what would be landscapes, but he's just pointing out places where people have died.
Yeah, he calls it Death Valley Highway.
Correct.
And that what is in the film is a drastically reduced version of what we captured on that day. I mean, it sounds like you watched the sequence,
yes.
And so he calls out more than a dozen homes,
Right.
and I would say that was a quarter of all of the material we captured. So there was so much. There was a longer version of that scene in an early edit, and at some point you just became numb to
Right.
the scope of death and suffering and destruction that he was pointing out. And so we realized we had to actually pull back a little bit, which was
Right.
startling.
Right. So how did you find this community?
Yeah, I grew up in the state, but in the northern part of the state. And I often get questions about West Virginia as a place. What is it like?
Right.
How do you describe it? How would you characterize it? And I always tell people that West Virginia is a transition state.
Mm-hmm.
The northern part of the state where I grew up does not feel like the South.
Right.
The South as we know it, as it's depicted. But the southern part of the state does a little bit more so.
Right.
And so even though I'm from the state of West Virginia, the opportunity to work on this project and spend so much time in the southern part of the state was really as much of a learning opportunity for me as it was for Meg, who was spending her first times in West Virginia.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think Scott and I run a production company focused on social impact documentary storytelling, and
Right.
so what's at the core of that is trying to uplift people, give them a platform to tell their stories. And I think from the beginning of our collaboration, we always wanted to tell a story in West Virginia, which is a place I think that is often either not represented at all or misrepresented. And so we really we were looking for a story that we thought was unique enough that could break through, but also kind of subverted some of those expectations. And so we went to West Virginia. We met somebody that ran a small community newspaper in Wheeling in the northern part of the state. And it was almost like a throwaway at the end of that conversation. He said, if you're looking to tell a story here, you should really meet this woman I went to high school with named Dr. Amjad. I think she's trying to move a town or something. And we were immediately like, that sounds really interesting.
That sounds very intriguing.
So Scott called her.
Yeah, we called her out of the blue in December of 2018. and explained that we were a couple of city slicker filmmakers from Los Angeles, but that at least one of us had grown up in West Virginia. And I'm not sure why, and this is such a common story, right? Documentarians are asked, how did you gain the trust of your subjects?
Yes.
And the honest answer is, I have no idea why
Okay.
she said yes to that initial call, but it was just something about the exchange we had. She said, you know what? Come on out in January of 2019, bring your cameras, and we can meet, we can talk. And we viewed that very much as an exploratory trip, but we captured so much footage during that first visit that really we never looked back after that. We just thought,
Right.
okay, we're making a film. At first we thought it was a short film, and then it slowly evolved over time. We shot for over 4 years.
Okay.
And at some point midway through that process, we realized this is going to be way too much content for a short. I think we're making a feature, which we had never done before. So that was a scary revelation.
Was it maybe the fact that you had never done it before that made it almost a little easier to do it? Because like, we have all this
I mean,
footage.
We totally
Let's-
benefited from being naive
Yeah,
and not realizing what we were
absolutely,
getting
yeah,
into.
Absolutely. Ignorance is an advantage in certain circumstances.
So the doctor, she is I want to say an unlikely hero, not in the sense that she is a hero as a physician, especially in an underserved community. But she puts herself into situations where she herself says she never politics, for one. She never would have done so. I'm sure when she was in medical school, she wasn't thinking about, oh yeah, part of my life will be not only caring for a community, but creating a community somewhere else and trying to get these folks there. So once you spent time with her, at what point did it click? And it might have been right away, or it might have been in the process that like, oh, this is even more unusual than we thought.
I mean, we might have different answers for this. For me, I think when the pandemic hit, that
Right.
was really like the shift in the narrative. Because when we met Ayn, she was kind of like reeling from the loss of her father. I think in some ways, like buying this land and having this ambitious plan was a way to fulfill his legacy.
Right.
She had really been left with his legacy because she had followed so closely in his footsteps. He was also a doctor in the
Right.
community for many years. But I think
And
that
she's dealing with that grief. and
exactly,
loss.
and I think in some ways that is the central theme of the
Right.
film. There's a real parallel between Ayn's grief that she experiences from losing her father, and I think the grief that many of the residents of the town of Minden have experienced as a result of losing so many friends and
Right.
family. But I think when the pandemic hit, I mean, I remember so clearly because Ayn called me and said, or she called us rather and said, this may be the end of our project because I've just put in an application to be the health commissioner of West Virginia. And she was like, I don't know if they're gonna let us keep filming.
Let you do that, yeah.
And, we actually recorded that conversation because we were like, this might just be the end of the whole
Right.
thing. But I think that the scope of her vision for how she could not only help Minden, but also the wider state of West Virginia,
Right.
at that point we were like, wow, the stakes just really ramped up.
Yeah.
So, we were going through the pandemic, she'd become the health commissioner, she'd never had a role of that scope really. And then meanwhile, she was still managing this effort to try to relocate and build the first home on the land that she
Right.
had purchased. So for me, that was the moment where I was like, whoa, this film just exploded into something much larger than I had ever imagined it could be.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We do have different answers to this question because I think in some ways the style of the filmmaking evolves as our understanding of Ayn's character and the scope of what she has taken on evolved. I think in the first act of the film, in the first 20 or 30 minutes, you'll see a lot more slow motion cinematography, sort of heroic looking portraits, landscapes. We tended to shoot more on the tripod as well for that first 30 minutes, and that is reflective of us seeing Ayn very much as a stereotypical hero figure.
Right.
We saw her very heroically when we first met her.
Right.
And then it was maybe a year or a year and a half into the production that we started to really understand the cost, the sort of psychological and emotional cost of the burden that she had taken on.
Right.
And at that point, I think just the way that we perceived the story started to feel a little more observational, a little
Okay.
less manipulated, a little less heroic, because it did not occur to us until midway through the project that what we were potentially doing is sort of deconstructing how we understand heroes in the environmental justice space,
Right.
which are often portrayed as fairly one note. You
Right.
don't often see the cost or the
The toll
burden,
it takes.
the toll
Yeah.
that it takes to bear that weight.
And that's, a common theme, I think, for documentarians is you go in thinking, whether it's thinking you have a short or a feature, you go in with one story in mind, and then the story decides this is where we're going.
I know, it's so funny you say that, because we tried to sell the movie early on in the process with our EP, and so we got to pitch to, all the big streamers,
Yeah.
which was really fun for us as first-time feature filmmakers, but
Dream.
we'd always get the question, what's gonna happen at the end? When we
Yeah.
were like 2 years into production,
Right.
and we were like, well, it's real life. Like,
Yeah,
I
I don't know.
We don't, will she move the town? We don't know.
Right. Well, and so that gets me to, I feel like we're reading each other's minds. The fiction Disney/Hollywood version of this movie is she does move the town, and they all move, and it's, yes, there's tragedy in the past, but there's a new life ahead. And reality is, folks didn't want, despite what they had lived with and the tragedy of this town, they didn't want to go. And that's, it's almost a gasping moment for a viewer to see that and understand that, and you just want to scream, "Why go? Why?" What was that like for you in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, it happened over time. I mean, I'll say, like, I'm not from West Virginia, but I'm from Texas, I think it made it very easy for me to move around West Virginia. There were a
Yeah.
lot of similarities. I think that, especially for people that like have migrated to coastal cities, it's very hard to understand being from a state or a town where a sense of place is so
Rooted in
connected
place.
to your
Yeah.
identity. And so I think while it was surprising, because people are saying one thing yet doing another, in some ways it's like the most natural thing to say, like, well, leaving this place actually strips me of who I am.
Right.
I don't know if you feel differently being from West Virginia, but
No, I essentially agree exactly with what you said. I mean, to answer your question, it was deeply frustrating to witness that. I remember there's a scene about a third of the way through the film where Ayn finally articulates her vision to a group of community members, and it is met with sort of silence.
Yeah.
And I think Meg and I were so frustrated for Ayn, even in the moment as we were shooting that. I remember sort of making eye contact with Meg,
Right.
like, is this happening? It was so the opposite of what we expected to unfold. And at first we were devastated as, from a filmmaking perspective, because we thought this isn't the Disney version of the story that we thought we were capturing.
Right.
And we really had to kind of fall in love with the story that we had rather than the story we expected to tell. And there were moments when we thought, should we complete this project? And I think hopefully people appreciate that this is not a very typical type of environmental justice story
Right.
that comes as a result really of our just sort of stubborn persistence and
Yeah.
refusal to quit. We thought, this isn't what we expected to tell, but we still see value here. Even if it's frustrating, even if it's a little divisive, even if it's a little unfulfilling.
Right.
It felt like life
I
to
was gonna
us
say,
in that way.
it's
Yeah.
authentic.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah.
So I don't want it. How do you've lived with this story for years now and these people? How does one move on to the next thing? I hear versions of this with like novelists when they finally finish the book, and it's like you want to, and I don't want to move you on from this. You want to live in this moment and be able to have this experience of people finally knowing what you knew. But how do you move on to the next project?
I've always felt really fortunate that Scott and I, because of the nature of our production company, we're always generating content. So
Right.
while we were creating Impossible Town, I mean, how many shorts did we put out during that time? I mean,
At least a dozen and a half.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
We were
and
doing
so
a lot of other work.
I think that we are very fortunate in that, like, while Impossible Town was always happening and we were in touch with our subjects and we were going to West Virginia at least 4 or 5 times a year and, you know, gathering footage and thinking about what we were making, we always had the benefit of, like, almost a distraction of, like, the other work we were doing.
Right.
And so that has continued to be the case, and I think that's been a real gift, because a lot of the independent filmmakers we know are like, they just have this one thing, and I think that that is like a blessing and a curse.
Right.
So to answer your question, I think like Impossible Town will always be with us, and I think this is an interesting moment, especially as the producer of the film, to be like, okay, how do you give it life now that you've made it?
Right.
And so it's very all-consuming, but I'm always so grateful that we have all the other projects in our slate to be focused on, which are in various stages of development. I don't know if you feel
That's
differently,
healthy.
but
It feels healthy. Yeah, I mean, another, I think, version of the answer to this question is that we've formed lasting relationships with a lot of the subjects in the film that will outlive the festival tour or ultimate distribution of the film itself. And so I imagine that we will be in touch with some of these folks for the rest of our lives. And in that way, the film and the experience we've had will continue to live
lives on.
Yeah.
So my last question for you both is, you know, your production company is focusing on social justice stories, which I'm sure is incredibly rewarding, but at the same time, it must take an emotional toll on you too, to kind of to be living. You know, we can call it social justice, but you are witnessing injustice again and again and again. How do you maintain your own sense of equilibrium?
Do we?
I feel like we do. I mean, it's interesting because Scott and I have worked together for a decade, and we came to this work from very different places. I was a journalist, and he was a teacher who had a film degree. And we worked for many years early on in our collaboration for nonprofits and at a marketing agency. And, you know, I think we started the company in the wake of the Trump election. And we felt like we wanted to use our voices to say something, to elevate different types of stories. And so for me, that has like continued to be very energizing. And we were having a conversation last night at one of the parties with another filmmaker, and just saying like, we feel so much passion around telling stories from these parts of the country, these regions that are misrepresented or underrepresented. And like, while it can be difficult, it feels like such a gift and an honor to be able to shine a spotlight on these communities across the country. So that's my answer. But
yeah, I mean, I think one of the most fascinating things about being a social impact focused filmmaker in this moment is that we are 2 white filmmakers. We're working in a space where one of the most topical conversations about filmmaking at the moment is authenticity and authorship. Who is telling whose stories, right? And having been a 5th grade teacher on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which was my first job, and my first, it sounds naive to say this, but not a lot of white people have the opportunity to be a racial minority because of the demographics of the nation and the way we sort of self-separate, right? I saw firsthand how my teacher colleagues who shared an indigenous identity with students had this additional opportunity for impact. So I deeply believe it's important that filmmakers from the communities that are being represented are telling those stories. But also, Meg and I believe very strongly that it takes storytelling from both sides, because while there are certain limitations that we have when we visit communities that we are not a part of, we also have an opportunity to talk to our community in a really unique way. And so navigating that tension and facing difficult conversations about our own identities and what gives us the right to move in certain communities has honestly been so rewarding, and we welcome those challenging conversations, and it's been fun to grapple with those issues and feel like we do have a specific part to play. Ours are not the only stories to tell, but they have a role in this larger ecosystem.
And it's so important. I mean, I think we're in a society now where people are either just so conflict averse they won't do anything, or they are so aggressive they are just in a conflict for conflict's sake because they're not listening. They are broadcasting but not listening. Last thing, you touched on something that I think is really important, and I was really glad to hear, is it's not just underrepresented communities, it's misperception.
Mhm.
And I think we all can fall prey to tropes about region, about people, about class, about politics, and it takes a lot of work to kind of get at that, and so it's, again, testament to you guys both in this film and in the shorts you're doing, and whatever, I'm not going to move you off this feature yet, but whatever feature you tackle next, I am heartened and gratified as just a citizen that you were doing the work you're doing, so it's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thanks for having us.
Of course,
Yeah.
thanks for being here, and
Yeah.
I hope you have a wonderful festival experience, both with your film and seeing other films and being in this community, because a small town in Vermont, you don't get to see these films in a theater,
Yeah.
and I know that the streaming business is insane, but that side of it, you are able to see stuff from your couch, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
I want to see movies like yours around other people and then have conversations with them then, rather than watching it.
Well, I think that's true from the filmmaker side as well.
I'm
You know,
sure.
it's like you wonder, like, well, what did people think? What questions did they have? What reactions?
Let's hear it.
So
Yes,
it's
be there and
really
hear it.
gratifying. And
Yeah.
Scott said, I think our film is challenging in a unique way, and so we're like excited for people to ask us hard questions.
To wrestle with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming
Thank you,
in.
Matt.
Yep.